Hi. Today we're going to tell you an unusual story full of emotions, conflicts, and important choices. It's the story of a woman who, tired of the monotony in her marriage, finds herself at a crossroads. She enters into an affair that pulls her into a world of passion and intrigue, putting everything she once considered right at risk. But before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's really interesting to see who's joined us. Now get comfortable and let's begin. The late August sun draped itself across the quiet suburban neighborhood like a thick velvet curtain. The air was heavy with warmth, the kind that made skin feel constantly kissed, almost stroked. Birds chirped lazily from the sycamores, and in the McAllister household, the cicadas hummed a slow rhythm of boredom and waiting. Elizabeth stood barefoot on the wooden deck, a glass of cold white wine in hand, her gaze fixed on the garden where the new neighbor was painting. Her robe, silken and light, clung softly to her hips. She didn't try to hide her watching. He was shirtless. Nicholas. That was the name he gave her 2 weeks ago when they first met at the mailbox. He was in his early 40s, slightly older than her, with dark hair streaked with silver and eyes like smudged charcoal. An artist, recently moved in from the East Coast, he told her. She could still remember the way his eyes lingered on her mouth when she spoke. Not rude, deliberate. Her husband, John, was at work again. He always was. Finance meetings, business dinners, conference calls. Their marriage was fine, polite, comfortable, in the same way an old sweater was warm, but never exciting. It had been months since he touched her with anything resembling hunger. Watching again? The voice startled her. Clara, her longtime friend, stepped onto the deck with a smirk and 2 more glasses of wine. She was bold, sensual, with red hair that danced wildly in the breeze, and a sense of humor that could slice through glass. Elizabeth smiled sheepishly. He's interesting to watch. Clara handed her a glass and leaned on the railing, also eyeing Nicholas with amusement. He has hands like a sinner, she whispered. You know what that means. Elizabeth laughed, but felt the heat rise up her neck. Clara always joked like that. Except sometimes, it didn't feel like jokes. Down in the garden, the young gardener Miguel pushed the lawnmower with slow, even passes. His tanned arms flexed under the sun, shirtless as well. Beside him, the housekeeper Sandra was trimming roses. Her shirt was tied at the waist, exposing a tattoo on her back. A delicate vine. Even the postman Ray had a knowing smile when he dropped off packages at noon. Elizabeth had begun to notice all of them. It wasn't just Nicholas. It was herself. It was as if the heat had awakened something in her body, something that had been waiting, ignored too long. Her dreams had become more vivid. In them, she was touched, whispered to, taken in shadowed corners by men whose faces she never saw, only felt. That night, John came home late. He kissed her on the cheek absently, loosened his tie, and complained about traffic. They ate in silence. She watched the lines on his face as he read emails on his phone. Later, in bed, he fell asleep quickly, as always, back turned. She lay awake, hand between her thighs, remembering the way Nicholas's hand brushed hers earlier when he returned a dropped earring. Remembering the wet gleam of sweat on Miguel's collarbone, the curve of Sandra's waist when she stretched for the pruning shears. Something had begun. She wasn't sure what, but she would not stop it. The morning was already warm when Elizabeth stepped into the kitchen. She wore a loose sundress that clung to her back with a single bead of sweat and nothing underneath. It was a small rebellion, one she wouldn't have dared a month ago. She poured coffee with trembling hands. Nicholas had left a note on her porch, a single white card tucked under a smooth stone. His handwriting was sharp, elegant. Come to the studio, noon. Wear red. She didn't own anything red. Not anymore. The last red dress she wore had been for their 5th anniversary years ago, and it had since disappeared in a box of old clothes. But she remembered how John looked at her that night. Hungry, proud. How long since then had she felt wanted? She found a red silk scarf in the back of her closet. It would do. Clara texted her around 10. Clara. You awake yet, sinner? Want to get to brunch and talk about your paintbrush fantasy? Elizabeth smirked at the screen but didn't reply. Instead, she stood in front of the mirror and tied the scarf around her neck, letting it trail down her bare chest. Her nipples brushed the fabric with every breath. She imagined Nicholas seeing it. Imagined his hands there instead. At exactly noon, she walked to his studio. It was a refurbished guest house at the back of his property, all windows and pale wood. The sun poured through the glass like melted gold. Inside, canvases leaned against every wall. Some abstract, some sharp with form, some purely bodies. Curves, lips, thighs. Nicholas was there, waiting. He wore a paint-streaked shirt unbuttoned halfway, and his fingers were already stained with color. He didn't smile when he saw her. He simply stared. Slow, deliberate, taking in the scarf, the heat in her eyes. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said softly. I wasn't either. He stepped closer, his hand brushing her collarbone. That scarf, it's more honest than anything you've said to me. I haven't said much. No, but your body speaks. She didn't answer, her breath caught in her throat, as his fingertips traced the line of silk down to the swell of her breast, lingering, barely touching. His eyes never left hers. He didn't kiss her. He undressed her with aching patience, like unwrapping something sacred. And when she stood before him, skin bare, pulse racing, he walked around her slowly, observing every inch like a sculptor before the first cut of stone. I want to paint you, he murmured. I want more than that, she said. And he gave her both. The couch beneath the window became their canvas. She lay on her back, knees parted. His mouth trailing a path from her ribs to the wet heat between her thighs. His hands held her open as he tasted her slowly, with reverence and greed. Her moans were soft at first, like questions. He answered them with tongue and breath, until she arched and trembled and spilled herself into his mouth like wine poured too quickly. Later, wrapped in an old linen blanket, she stared at the half-finished canvas he had started. Her body sketched in quick, urgent lines. You made me feel like art, she whispered. You are, he replied, but not mine. She didn't ask what he meant. When she returned home, John wasn't there. But Clara was, sitting at the kitchen island, wearing sunglasses and a guilty smile. I used your pool, Clara said. Hope you don't mind. Your gardener is a delight. Elizabeth tilted her head. Miguel? Mm-hmm. Clara sipped iced tea with a grin. That boy has arms carved by angels and a mouth like a sin waiting to happen. Elizabeth laughed, but felt a flicker of jealousy she didn't understand. Clara set down her glass. You're glowing, she said, and don't lie to me. I know that look. What look? I've just been thoroughly fucked by someone who isn't my husband look. Elizabeth blushed hard. Clara's voice dropped. Good. It's about damn time. That night, Elizabeth sat in the bath, legs still weak. She traced a fingertip across her thigh and thought about how easily she had slipped from wife to lover. The guilt hadn't come. Not yet. Only the memory of his mouth and the taste of being seen. When she stepped out, she caught her reflection. Something had changed. Not in her face. In her eyes. The days that followed blurred into a haze of heat and stolen hours. Elizabeth could no longer pretend. Every time she walked into the garden, every time she passed the guest house where Nicholas painted in silence, she felt her skin hum. Her body had learned a new language. One of touches, glances, the subtle power of surrender. And it craved more. John noticed the change, not directly, not with suspicion, but with a distant awareness, as though something was shifting just out of reach. You seem lighter, he said one evening, seated beside her on the couch, eyes on his tablet. Elizabeth smiled faintly. Maybe I've been taking better care of myself. He nodded, distracted. That's good. I have to fly to Chicago next week. Just 2 nights. Of course he did. They hadn't had sex in almost 3 months. That night, she lay awake, the ceiling fan turning lazily above her. Thoughts came in waves. Nicholas' fingers between her thighs, his breath at her ear, the rough fabric of the studio couch against her back. She slid her hand beneath the covers. She didn't even try to be quiet. The next afternoon, she returned to the studio without being asked. Nicholas was painting, a large canvas drenched in deep purples and reds. He didn't greet her, didn't stop. You're late, he said without turning. I wasn't invited. You don't need an invitation anymore. She moved toward him, slowly undoing the buttons of her dress. By the time she reached him, the garment was slipping to the floor. I want you, she said. He turned. His eyes were hungry again, but something else was there too. Restraint. For the first time, he didn't touch her. I don't just want your body, he said. I want your choices. She stared at him. I've already made them, she whispered. That was all it took. He took her against the wall, rougher this time, more desperate. Her hands clawed at his back, legs wrapped around his hips, her moans swallowed by his mouth. She didn't care if the window was open. She didn't care if someone saw. Later, as she dressed, he handed her something folded. A photo. It was a sketch of her, bent over the stool, head thrown back in pleasure. I want you to keep it, he said. Why? Because you need to remember who you are becoming. As she walked back across the lawn, Sandra was trimming the hedges. Their eyes met. The housekeeper's expression was unreadable, but her gaze lingered too long. Elizabeth felt a chill despite the sun. Inside the kitchen, Clara was already there. I let myself in, she said with a wink. Elizabeth sighed. That's becoming a habit. Clara raised an eyebrow. You're welcome. She held up a small silver box. What's that? A game? Clara said. Cards. Questions. For adults only. Elizabeth hesitated. Where did you get it? Violet gave it to me, from the club. Elizabeth blinked. What club? Clara smiled coyly. You're not the only one exploring lately, darling. They sat on the floor by the fireplace, legs crossed, wine open. Clara shuffled the cards, truth or dare, but with less shame. She said, pick one. Elizabeth drew a card, read it. Her cheeks flushed. Have you ever fantasized about being watched while making love? She swallowed. Yes, Clara purred. By whom? Elizabeth hesitated. Nicholas, Miguel Ombl, maybe even Clara. I don't know, she said. Strangers or not? Clara reached for a card, smiled. Kiss the person to your left. Without a word, she leaned forward and brushed her lips across Elizabeth's, soft, lingering. When she pulled away, her eyes didn't waver. Elizabeth's heart pounded. I should go, she said, rising. Clara stood too. Should you? Elizabeth didn't answer. That night, John returned home early. He wrapped his arms around her from behind in the kitchen and kissed her neck. It surprised her. You smell like summer, he murmured. And just like that, something cracked open. She let him lead her to bed, let him touch her. He was gentle, careful. As if afraid of the breaking whatever warmth had returned to her, she closed her eyes and imagined Nicola. And when she came, quietly, neatly, she whispered a name she hoped John didn't hear. The next morning, Sandra avoided her gaze. Elizabeth knew the house had ears, and still she didn't stop. The days grew hotter as August lingered, the sun heavier with every passing hour. Elizabeth had become a ghost in her own home, drifting between rooms, between people, between desires that whispered loudly in her head. John had stopped asking questions. He still kissed her every morning before work, though his touch had become perfunctory, mechanical, like something expected rather than desire. And he was gone most nights, often late, leaving her to her thoughts and her secret meetings. Nicholas didn't call. He didn't text. He was just there, a presence, a constant undercurrent in her life. Every time she saw him, it was as if she had to brace herself. But what was she bracing against? The truth? The truth had already slipped past her guard, and now she couldn't remember what it had been like before. The sun was setting when Elizabeth walked into the studio again, her heart thudding in her chest, as though it knew exactly where she was headed. She'd been avoiding him in a way. She had told herself it was just an affair, just sex, but it wasn't. He was more than that. He was the secret she had never known she needed. He was everything she had never allowed herself to want. When she reached the door, she hesitated. She could hear the soft scrape of his brush against canvas, the low hum of music playing from an old speaker. She didn't knock. She just opened the door, stepping inside. Nicholas didn't turn. He continued painting, the strokes smooth and deliberate. His back was to her, and for a moment, Elizabeth watched him, the man who had turned her world upside down. When he finally turned to face her, There was no question, no hesitation. There was only the unspoken recognition of what they had already shared. "You're here," he said, his voice a rasp, like he had been waiting for this moment as much as she had. "I shouldn't be," she replied, her pulse quickening. "Then why are you?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Instead, she crossed the room to him, her fingers grazing the edge of the canvas. He watched her, dark eyes following every movement as she stepped closer. And then he kissed her. It wasn't like the others. This wasn't the hurried, desperate passion of their first encounters. This was slow, patient, a kiss that said everything that neither of them could express aloud. It was the recognition of desire, of longing, of something deeper, something that neither of them could control anymore. His hands found her body again, but this time there was no rush, no urgency. His fingers traced her skin, mapping out every curve as if she were a painting. Something delicate, something precious. He lifted her slowly, settling her on the nearest easel, the cold metal pressing against her back. She didn't care. She didn't care about anything except him, except the way he made her feel. "I want you, Elizabeth," he whispered against her lips. "I've already given you everything," she breathed back, her hands tangling in his hair. "But I don't know how much more I have left." His eyes flashed darkly. "You have more. I'll make you remember." And he did. Her body trembled under his touch. His mouth moved slowly over her, his hands tracing patterns across her skin, as if he were learning her all over again. She felt as if she were falling, a dizzying plunge into something she couldn't understand. He was rougher this time, pressing her against the hard wood of the easel, guiding her with a power she had never known she craved. Her breath caught as he entered her, slow and deep, his rhythm firm and demanding. There was no tenderness in this, no softness, just raw, unfiltered need. She clung to him, her legs wrapping around his waist as she met him with equal force. The studio was filled with the sound of their bodies, the rough friction of skin on skin, the sharp, steady rhythm that pulsed between them. Every time he thrust deeper, she felt it. The overwhelming sensation of being taken, of losing herself in something wild, something dangerous. And it wasn't just about the sex. It was about everything they had created in this space. The quiet tension that lingered, the unspoken connection that had become impossible to ignore. He came with a low, guttural groan, and she followed moments later, her entire body convulsing with the intensity of it. She clung to him, her nails digging into his shoulders as the world spun around them. When it was over, when the aftershocks of pleasure had faded, they remained tangled together on the floor. The only sound was their breathing, heavy, ragged. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Elizabeth let her head fall back against the canvas, eyes closed, lost in the haze of the moment. She had never felt more alive, more real than she did in this space with him. Finally, he shifted, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "What now?" he asked quietly. She didn't have an answer. She couldn't. "I don't know," she whispered. "But I can't stop." "I don't want you to," he replied, his voice rough with something deeper than desire. When she left the studio, the sun had almost set completely, and the cool night air felt sharp against her skin. She walked back across the lawn, her heart still racing, her body still alive with the echoes of what they had shared. But as she reached the door of her house, she paused. The guilt that had been gnawing at her for days suddenly became more pronounced, sharper. John would be home soon. She hadn't thought about him at all while she was with Nicholas. The house was quiet, too quiet, and somewhere deep inside, she wondered if it would always be this way, torn between two worlds, one of comfort and routine, and the other of passion and danger. She didn't know which world she belonged to anymore. The days passed with a strange rhythm. The morning sun would rise and set, and each time, Elizabeth found herself navigating a world of dualities. The life she had with John seemed to stretch farther away, more distant with every encounter in the studio, every stolen moment with Nicholas. But when she returned home, she would slip into her role once again. Wife, mother, daughter, friend, the careful masks she wore daily, but which no longer fit as well. She couldn't stop the urge to return to Nicholas. Each time she thought about walking away, the memory of his touch would seize her. And she found herself at the door again, stepping into the air thick with anticipation, not caring who saw. The truth was, she was trapped. By herself. John still didn't notice. Or if he did, he said nothing. He went about his day as usual, leaving her to her thoughts. But the guilt crept in like an unwelcome visitor, knocking at the door of her conscience. The act itself, the affair, was thrilling, an escape from the predictability of her marriage. But every time she returned to the house, there was that uncomfortable sense of betrayal gnawing at her insides. Yet she didn't stop. And then, one evening, it all unraveled. It was a Friday, and John had announced he would be home early. He had planned a special dinner, a nice bottle of wine, his favorite meal, and the usual quiet laughter at the end of the day. Elizabeth had no idea that this would be the night everything changed. She hadn't planned on seeing Nicholas that afternoon, but somehow she found herself in the studio again. There was a restlessness in her bones, an unease she hadn't felt in weeks. She had been avoiding him for the past few days, letting the distance grow between them. But now, it was impossible to stay away. When she arrived, the door to the studio was open. He was inside, sitting on the floor, sketching a new piece. There were no words, no need for them. They had crossed that line a long time ago. She simply walked in, closed the door behind her, and moved toward him. But tonight, things were different. Nicholas looked up when she entered, his eyes dark, as though he could already sense what had been building inside her. His expression was unreadable, but there was a trace of something. Disappointment, perhaps? Or maybe it was regret. She wasn't sure. But he didn't stand when she approached. He stayed seated, his gaze flicking to her hands, then back to her face. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. She stopped in front of him, her hands trembling slightly. "I don't know." There was silence. She swallowed, struggling to find the words. She hadn't expected to come here and be vulnerable. She thought she could keep it all together. But the longer she spent in this space with him, the more she realized she couldn't. "I don't want to lie to him anymore," she whispered. "I don't want to be this person, this secret." Nicholas stood up slowly, stepping toward her. "You don't have to lie," he said. "You don't have to be anything you're not." But she wasn't sure about that anymore. She didn't know how to separate the woman she had become from the one who had married John. She had crossed a line that seemed impossible to erase. The doorbell rang. Elizabeth froze. Her heart skipped a beat. Nicholas turned toward the door, and before she could say anything, he moved toward it. "Stay here," he said, his voice now tinged with something darker. "I'll answer." He opened the door. Standing there, looking calm but clearly agitated, was John. For a moment, time seemed to stop. John's eyes flicked to Elizabeth, his gaze lingering on her, then shifting back to Nicholas, who was standing in the doorway. There was no greeting, no pleasantries, only tension hanging thick between them. "I thought you'd be at work," Nicholas said casually, though his posture was stiff. "What brings you by?" John didn't answer right away. He just kept staring at Elizabeth, his eyes cold. "I should have known," he said finally, his voice tight with something unrecognizable. "I should have known when you stopped looking at me the way you used to." Elizabeth felt her stomach drop. Her throat went dry. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said quickly, stepping forward. "You don't need to lie anymore," John said, his words sharp now. "I saw the sketch. I saw what you've been doing." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" she asked, though she already knew. She had seen the sketch before, in Nicholas's studio. Her body exposed, her face painted in ecstasy. "Don't lie to me," John snapped, stepping into the room. "I've been watching. I saw the way you've been sneaking around. I saw the way you looked at him." Nicholas took a step back, but Elizabeth didn't know what to say. Her heart was pounding in her chest. The truth had finally caught up with her, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. How could she explain this to John? How could she explain what had happened? What was happening? Without destroying everything? John turned to Nicholas. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this ends now." There was a silence that seemed to stretch forever. And then, without warning, John stepped forward, his hand gripping Elizabeth's arm. "We're leaving," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "You don't get to do this. Not to me, not to us." Nicholas stood there watching, saying nothing, as John pulled Elizabeth toward the door. And in that moment, Elizabeth felt something inside her snap. The drive home was unbearable. John's silence in the car was thick with the weight of everything unsaid. His grip on the steering wheel was tight, knuckles white, and Elizabeth couldn't bring herself to break the silence. She stared out the window, watching the world pass by, her mind spinning in a haze of emotions she wasn't sure how to navigate. She had known this moment would come, but she hadn't expected it to feel like this, like a sudden, violent rupture in everything she had ever known. She had thought she could keep her world separate, that she could indulge her desires with Nicholas and still be the wife John deserved. But the truth had come crashing down, and now she was left with nothing but the broken pieces of her own choices. When they finally reached the house, John didn't even look at her as he parked the car. He simply got out, slammed the door, and walked toward the front door. Elizabeth hesitated for a moment before following him. Inside, the house felt cold, silent. John stood by the staircase, his back to her, his shoulders rigid with tension. Elizabeth opened her mouth to speak, to apologize, to explain herself, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain it all? How could she make him understand? "I don't know what to say to you anymore," John said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't turn around. "You've already said everything. You've shown me who you really are." Elizabeth swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." John shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Hurt me? Is that what this is about? I thought we were happy. I thought I was enough for you." "You are enough," she said desperately, stepping closer. I don't know what happened. I don't know how it went this far." John's eyes flicked toward her, but there was no tenderness in his gaze. "But it did happen, and I can't pretend it didn't." The pain in his voice cut deeper than any accusation. Elizabeth reached out, but he stepped back, as if her touch would burn him. "I need space," he said, his voice low but firm. "I need time to figure out what comes next." Elizabeth's heart cracked. She nodded slowly, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "Okay," she whispered, unable to say anything else. John turned away from her, walking toward the kitchen without another word. Elizabeth stood there, motionless, unsure of what to do next. The house felt smaller now, claustrophobic. It was no longer the sanctuary it had once been. It was a cage. The next few days were a blur. John withdrew into himself, retreating into his office, making excuses to be away from her. The silence between them grew unbearable, thick with unspoken words. Elizabeth felt the weight of her actions settle over her like a suffocating blanket. She had destroyed everything. One night, after another long, lonely evening, she found herself standing in front of the studio again. The moonlight bathed the garden in a soft glow, casting long shadows across the grass. Her steps were slow, hesitant, but there was something pulling her forward, something she couldn't ignore. Nicholas had not contacted her since that night. The space between them had grown, filled with the consequences of her decisions. But still, she couldn't shake the pull. She needed him, more than she had ever needed anything in her life. She knocked softly on the door, the sound echoing in the still night. A moment later, it opened, and Nicholas stood in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, a slight furrow in his brow as he studied her. But there was no anger, no reproach, just understanding. "I thought you might come," he said, his voice low and steady. "I didn't think you would wait this long." "I didn't know what to do," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I don't know what to say, Nicholas. I don't know how to fix this." He stepped aside, opening the door wider for her to enter. She hesitated for a moment before crossing the threshold. The studio felt different now. The vibrant, chaotic energy that had once surrounded them seemed muted, the air thick with the weight of their past actions. Nicholas didn't speak at first. He just watched her, his gaze soft, almost mournful. Finally, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You've made a mess of things," he said, his voice gentle but honest. "But I'm not going to pretend I don't want you here." Elizabeth looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. I don't know what I want anymore, she whispered. I thought I could have both. I thought I could be everything to everyone. But I've lost everything. Nicholas stepped forward, his fingers brushing her cheek, lifting her chin so their eyes met. You haven't lost everything. You've lost a part of yourself, but you can still find it again. It's not too late. I don't deserve this, she said, tears welling in her eyes. I don't deserve you. You don't have to deserve anything, he replied softly. You just have to decide what you want, what you need. For a long moment they stood there, the weight of their emotions hanging between them. Elizabeth wanted to give in, wanted to collapse into his arms and forget about the mess she had made. But something inside her told her that she couldn't run away anymore. She needed to face the consequences of her actions. I can't stay here, she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears. I need to figure this out. I need to be alone. I can't keep running from my life. Nicola didn't say anything. He didn't try to stop her. He simply nodded, his suppression a mixture of understanding and sadness. I'll be here, he said quietly. Whenever you're ready. Elizabeth took one last look at him, her heart heavy with regret. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the studio, back into the night. The road ahead was unclear, but for the first time in a long time, she knew she had to find her own way. No one else could do it for her. She had crossed the line, but now she had to learn how to live with the consequences.